Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are places in this world where we feel safe without question. We feel safe in the forests where families hike on Sunday mornings, their laughter echoing through pine-scented air. We feel safe in relationships built on promises whispered in the quiet hours of night. We feel safe in our neighborhoods, where streetlights flicker on at dusk and children play until their mothers call them home. We feel safe in our routines, the familiar paths we walk without thinking, the daily rhythms that convince us tomorrow will be just like today. But what happens when safety becomes an illusion? What happens when the places we trust most become hunting grounds? What happens when predators don't force their way into our lives, but wait patiently to be invited in? Tonight, you'll hear 4 stories that shatter our assumptions about danger. A drifter who made protected wilderness his personal territory. A woman who discovered that leaving an abusive relationship is the moment when violence escalates from threat to reality. A city that learned to fear the darkness, not knowing the monster walked among them in daylight. And 2 teenagers whose ordinary afternoon became evidence that would take years to unlock. These stories span different decades, different landscapes, different kinds of evil. But they share one truth that law enforcement investigators know too well. Predators don't announce themselves. They study us. They wait. They blend into the background of our lives until the moment we're most vulnerable. And by then, it's often too late to run. Each case you'll hear tonight changed the people who survived it, the families who lost someone, and the communities forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Danger doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it carries a dog on a leash. Sometimes it knows your name. This is a story about patterns, about the warning signs we miss because we've been taught that evil looks a certain way, about the courage it takes to escape, to fight back, to leave evidence behind even when hope seems lost, and about the persistence of investigators who refuse to let cases go cold, who follow threads of evidence that seem impossibly thin, who believe that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for. The first story begins in a place that represents freedom to most people: the wilderness. Miles of protected forest where the air smells like rain and earth, where trails wind through territory that predates roads and cities, where human concerns feel small against the magnitude of ancient trees and endless sky. For decades, Pine Ridge Preserve attracted hikers from across the region. Families came to teach children about nature. Retired couples came to walk trails they'd explored for years. Solo adventurers came seeking solitude and challenge. The preserve stretched across 3 counties, encompassing over 40,000 acres of dense forest, rocky outcroppings, hidden waterfalls, and trails ranging from easy loops to multi-day backpacking routes that tested even experienced wilderness travelers. Rangers who worked Pine Ridge and the neighboring Blue Hollow Trails and Cedar Crest Wilderness knew most of the regular visitors by sight. There was the elderly couple who hiked every Saturday morning, always finishing by noon. The group of college students who came each fall to watch leaves turn gold and crimson. The woman who ran the same 12-mile loop 3 times a week, training for ultramarathons. And there was Raymond Cole Barrett. Barrett seemed harmless. That's what everyone would say later when investigators asked them to remember. He seemed harmless. Just another drifter who loved the outdoors more than civilization. He drove a faded cargo van that he'd converted into a mobile home of sorts, with a small camping stove, a sleeping bag, and barely enough room to stand upright. He traveled from forest to forest, staying at campgrounds until he'd exhausted the local trails, then moving on. He always had his dog with him, a mixed breed named Scout who had the kind of calm temperament that made people trust Barrett instantly. A man who loves his dog that much can't be dangerous, one ranger remembered thinking. Scout was so well trained, so gentle. Barrett would sit by the campfire at night, and Scout would lie at his feet, and it just seemed like a peaceful life. Like he'd figured something out that the rest of us were missing. Barrett talked to other hikers when their paths crossed. He'd recommend trails, warn about areas where recent storms had made conditions dangerous, share advice about the best times to see wildlife. He never asked personal questions, never pushed conversations beyond pleasantries. He was just there, a familiar presence in an environment where familiar felt safe. In October, Walter and Elaine Morris decided to celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary with a hike they'd been planning for months. Both in their early 70s, they were experienced hikers who'd spent their retirement exploring every major preserve in the region. They'd hiked portions of Pine Ridge before, but never the northern section where the terrain grew more challenging and fewer people ventured. They told their daughter they'd be gone for 3 days, hiking a 20-mile loop that would take them deep into the preserve. They'd camp at designated sites, check in via satellite messenger each evening, and return Thursday afternoon. It was a routine they'd followed dozens of times. Their daughter didn't worry. Her parents were careful. They knew what they were doing. Thursday afternoon came. No call. The satellite messenger showed their last check-in Tuesday night from a campsite approximately 8 miles into their route. After that, silence. By Friday morning, search and rescue teams were mobilized. The satellite data gave them a starting point, but the preserve's density made searching difficult. Teams covered the marked trails first, then began systematic grid searches of the surrounding area. They found the Morrises' tent at the designated campsite, still standing but empty. Their backpacks were gone. Most of their supplies remained. It looked like they'd left for a day hike, the lead search coordinator explained. They'd taken water, snacks, their camera, but left the bulk of their gear. That suggested they planned to return to camp. Searchers worked for 2 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from neighboring counties. They found no trace of Walter and Elaine Morris beyond that campsite. The case transitioned from rescue to recovery to missing persons investigation. The file remained open, but active searching ceased. 2 months later, Hannah Pierce drove 6 hours to Cedar Crest Wilderness to celebrate New Year's alone. She was 29, a nurse who'd just ended a difficult relationship and wanted time to think. She'd been backpacking since college and felt confident in her skills. She planned a 4-day solo trip, hiking trails she'd researched carefully. She sent her itinerary to her best friend, packed her gear with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this many times, and started up the trailhead on December 30th. Her friend expected to hear from Hannah on January 3rd. When no call came, she waited one more day, telling herself that Hannah might have extended her trip. By January 5th, she contacted authorities. Rangers found Hannah's car in the trailhead parking lot. Inside, they found her purse, her phone charging cable, and a notebook where she'd written her planned route. Search teams deployed immediately. Unlike the Morris case, they had a clear route to follow. They found evidence that Hannah had camped at her planned first-night location. They found tracks suggesting she'd continued hiking the next day. Then the trail went cold. "We searched for 3 weeks," one ranger recalled. "We covered every mile of trail she could have reasonably reached. We expanded the search beyond reasonable hiking distance. We found nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air." The 2 cases seemed unconnected at first. Different locations, different times of year, different victims. But a detective reviewing missing persons reports across the region noticed something. Both cases involved experienced hikers who disappeared in protected wilderness areas. Both vanished completely, leaving minimal evidence behind. Both had been hiking in areas where a drifter named Raymond Barrett had been camping. That detail alone wasn't enough for a warrant. Barrett was interviewed as a potential witness, someone who might have seen something useful. He was cooperative, even helpful. Yes, he'd been camping in Pine Ridge when the Morris couple disappeared. He'd actually passed them on the trail the day before they vanished. They'd exchanged brief greetings. He'd moved to a different preserve a week later, his normal pattern. He hadn't seen anything suspicious. Detectives had nothing to hold him on. He left the interview with assurances he'd contact them if he remembered anything helpful. 3 months passed. Barrett continued his circuit through wilderness areas. Rangers at different preserves noted his presence, but had no reason to be concerned. He was just Raymond Barrett, the harmless drifter with the gentle dog. Then a bank fraud investigator noticed something unusual. Small withdrawals from Walter Morris's checking account. Nothing dramatic. $50 here, $75 there. Amounts that might not trigger immediate attention except for one detail. Walter Morris had been missing for 6 months. The transactions occurred at ATMs in small towns near wilderness areas. Security footage showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, face partially obscured, using a card at machines that didn't require PIN verification for small amounts. The man wore gloves. He kept his head down. But in one frame, Captured as he walked away from an ATM in a town called Millbrook, the camera caught something else. A dog. A mixed breed that looked remarkably like Scout. Investigators pulled footage from every ATM transaction tied to the Morris account. They tracked a pattern of withdrawals stretching across 4 states, always in rural areas, always small amounts, always near public land where Barrett was known to camp. They obtained warrants for his van, his campsite, his limited possessions. When they found Barrett 3 weeks later camped in a national forest outside Colorado, he was in the process of burning clothing. He saw the patrol vehicles approaching and tried to run. Scout, confused by his owner's panic, stayed near the van instead of following. That hesitation gave officers the seconds they needed. Inside Barrett's van, investigators found items that turned their suspicions into horror. Elaine Morris's wedding ring, tucked inside a sock. Hannah Pierce's driver's license, hidden beneath the van's floor mat. A digital camera containing photos neither victim would have willingly allowed. Detailed notes about hiking patterns, trail conditions, and the schedules of frequent visitors to various preserves. And a collection of ATM cards with names that didn't belong to Raymond Barrett. But it was what they found buried near his campsite that revealed the full scope of his crimes. A shallow grave containing personal items, identification, and evidence that Barrett had been preying on hikers for potentially years. 3 sets of remains were eventually recovered from locations Barrett reluctantly disclosed during interrogation. Walter and Elaine Morris. Hannah Pierce, and a hiker who'd been reported missing 14 months earlier in Oregon. During interrogation, Barrett showed no remorse. He spoke about his crimes with the detached tone of someone describing a hobby. He explained his method with disturbing clarity. He would identify vulnerable targets, typically people hiking alone or in small groups in remote areas. He'd establish himself as a familiar presence, someone hikers saw repeatedly and therefore stopped noticing. He'd study their patterns, learn their routes, determine when they'd be most isolated. People trust routine, he told investigators. They think because they've hiked a trail 10 times safely, the 11th time will be safe too. They think because someone has a dog, he must be safe. They think being experienced means being protected. But experience makes you predictable, and predictable means vulnerable. Barrett would approach his victims when they were far from help, usually on the 2nd or 3rd day of a multi-day hike when they were tired, when their guard was down, when they hadn't seen another person for hours. He used friendliness as a weapon. He'd offer trail advice, share food, create a moment of connection that made victims lower their defenses. Then he'd wait for the right moment. Sometimes that was minutes, sometimes hours. He kept victims alive for days, sometimes weeks. He'd force them to access their bank accounts, making small withdrawals that wouldn't immediately trigger alerts. He'd take them deeper into wilderness, moving camp frequently, always staying ahead of search patterns. He knew the forests better than the rangers who patrolled them. He knew where helicopters couldn't see through dense canopy. He knew which areas were searched first and which were considered too remote to be probable. The cruelty wasn't just physical. Barrett understood psychological torture. He'd tell victims about search efforts, about how close rescuers had come before turning back. He'd show them news articles about themselves, let them hear their families pleading for their return. He'd give them hope, then crush it. He enjoyed the control more than the violence. The violence, he said, was just necessary. When prosecutors compiled evidence for trial, they faced a challenge. Barrett had operated across multiple states, multiple jurisdictions. Each location wanted justice. They coordinated to ensure he faced maximum accountability. He was ultimately convicted in 3 separate trials, sentenced to multiple life terms without possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated in a maximum security facility where he'll spend the rest of his life. Scout, the dog who'd been both accomplice and unwitting lure, was adopted by one of the rangers who'd arrested Barrett. The rangers said Scout needed years to trust fully again, that the dog seemed to carry trauma from whatever he'd witnessed in those forests. The Morris family established a wilderness safety foundation in Walter and Elaine's memory. They worked to educate hikers about risks that aren't typically discussed, about the fact that predators exist even in spaces we consider pure and safe. Hannah Pierce's best friend became an advocate for improved tracking technology for solo hikers, pushing for better satellite communication systems and emergency response protocols in remote areas. But the cases left questions that still haunt investigators. How many victims were there really? Barrett was conclusively connected to 4 deaths, but his movements over nearly a decade suggest the possibility of more. There are missing persons cases in 6 states that share similar patterns, experienced hikers who vanished in wilderness areas where Barrett was known to camp. Without confessions or physical evidence, those cases remain technically unsolved. The second story begins not in wilderness, but in a place that should have been a sanctuary, a home, a relationship, a promise of love and partnership and safety. Samira Noor was 26 when she met Elias Rahman at a community event in Manchester. She was finishing her degree in social work, passionate about helping families in crisis, determined to build a career focused on supporting vulnerable people. He was 32, confident and charming, working in technology consulting with an easy smile and the kind of attention that made Samira feel seen in ways she hadn't experienced before. Their courtship was intense. Elias pursued her with focus and romantic gestures that swept away her initial hesitation. He brought her flowers after long study sessions. He showed up at her university library with coffee exactly the way she liked it. He remembered every detail she shared about her life, her family, her dreams. He made her feel like the center of his world. He was everything I'd been told to look for, Samira would later tell counselors. Respectful, thoughtful. He talked about partnership and equality. He said all the right things about women's independence, about supporting my career, about building a life together where we'd both grow. I thought I'd found someone who understood me. They married after 8 months. Samira's family had reservations about the quick timeline, but they liked Elias. He was polite to her parents, respectful of their traditions while also embracing modern ideas. He seemed like a good match, a safe choice. The control started small. So small that Samira didn't recognize it as control at first. Elias suggested she might be happier if she spent less time with certain friends, the ones he felt were negative influences. He encouraged her to focus on their relationship rather than social obligations that pulled her away. He wanted to know where she was, not because he didn't trust her, he explained, but because he loved her and wanted to feel connected to her day. Samira rationalized each request. This was what partners did, right? They prioritized each other. They made adjustments. She told herself that spending less time with friends was a natural part of building a marriage. That checking in frequently was actually sweet, evidence of how much he cared. When Elias suggested they move to Northbridge, a smaller city where he'd been offered a promotion, Samira hesitated. It would mean leaving Manchester, leaving the city where she'd built her professional network, leaving proximity to her family. But Elias framed it as an adventure. A fresh start for both of them. An opportunity to build their own life away from outside influences. I wanted to believe him, Samira recalled. I wanted to believe we were building something together. I didn't see that he was isolating me. That every decision that seemed mutual was actually designed to cut off my support systems. In Northbridge, the control intensified. Elias monitored her phone constantly. He demanded access to all her accounts, email, social media, banking. He said it was about transparency, about having nothing to hide from each other. When Samira expressed discomfort, he accused her of being secretive, of not trusting him, of potentially cheating. The first time he hit her, it was after she'd mentioned wanting to visit her family for a weekend. He apologized immediately, crying, saying he didn't know what came over him, that stress from work had made him lose control. He promised it would never happen again. He was so convincing in his remorse that Samira convinced herself it was an isolated incident. It wasn't. Over the next year, the violence escalated. Physical abuse alternated with periods of intense affection. Elias would hurt her, then love bomb her with apologies and gifts and promises to change. He'd blame external factors, work stress, financial pressure, her behavior. He'd say if she just tried harder to make him happy, if she just stopped doing things that triggered his anger, the violence would stop. Samira became pregnant. She thought maybe a child would change things, would remind Elias of what mattered. Instead, her pregnancy made her more vulnerable. The abuse continued. Elias controlled every aspect of her prenatal care, attending every appointment, monitoring every conversation with doctors, ensuring she never had private moments to disclose what was happening. Their daughter was born in March. Samira named her Layla. And holding her daughter for the first time, feeling that small body depend entirely on her protection, Samira realized she had to leave. But leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time. Statistics show that women are most likely to be killed when they try to escape. Samira knew this. She'd studied it in her social work courses. She'd counseled women in similar situations. But knowing didn't make escape easier. She planned carefully. She contacted a domestic violence shelter, speaking in whispers during the few moments Elias left her alone. She opened a secret bank account, slowly moving small amounts of money he wouldn't notice missing. She gathered important documents, hiding copies where he wouldn't find them. She waited for the right moment. That moment came on a Tuesday morning when Elias left early for a work trip. He'd be gone for 3 days. Samira had 72 hours to disappear. She called the shelter. They sent someone to help her pack. Essential items only. Clothes for her and Layla. Documents. Medication. Nothing sentimental. Nothing that would slow them down. Within 2 hours, she was gone. The shelter was in a different city, its location carefully protected. Samira felt safer than she had in months. Counselors helped her file for a protective order. They connected her with legal aid. They assured her that she'd done the hardest part, that leaving was the biggest step. But Elias wasn't accepting her departure. He reported her as a kidnapping victim, claiming she'd taken their daughter illegally. He filed emergency custody motions. He contacted her family, crying, saying Samira was having a mental health crisis and needed help. He was convincing. Samira's own parents initially believed him. The protective order meant Elias legally couldn't contact her. But laws only work when they're enforced. And Elias found ways around legal restrictions. He tracked her phone. She'd changed her number, but he'd installed monitoring software she didn't know about. He found her location. He started sending messages from anonymous numbers. Photos of places she'd been that day. Proof he knew where she was. Threats about what he'd do when he found her. Samira moved shelters 3 times. Each time, she thought she'd finally achieved invisibility. Each time, Elias found her. The stalking continued for months. Counselors advised Samira to document everything, to save every message, every photo, every threat. They assured her this evidence would matter, that the legal system would protect her. But protection orders are paper. They don't stop bullets. They don't stop determined men who believe ownership is love. In September, 7 months after she'd left, Samira made a mistake. She took Layla to a public park in daylight, believing that a crowded space meant safety. She watched other mothers pushing strollers, children playing on swings, people living normal lives. She wanted that normality. She wanted one afternoon where fear didn't dictate every choice. Elias was waiting. He'd tracked her phone to the park. He'd been watching for an opportunity. He approached Samira near the playground, his movements quick and purposeful. Witnesses later said he seemed calm, almost casual, until he got close enough to grab her. "You belong to me," he said. "You and Layla. You can't just leave." Samira screamed. She held Layla tight and screamed for help. Other parents rushed forward. A man tried to intervene, placing himself between Samira and Elias. That man, whose name was David Chun, probably saved Samira's life. His presence made Elias hesitate just long enough for police sirens to become audible in the distance. Someone had called emergency services immediately. Officers arrived within 3 minutes. They found Elias still at the scene, arguing that he had a right to see his daughter, that Samira was keeping his child from him. They arrested him for violating the protective order, for stalking, for attempted assault. This time, prosecutors took the case seriously. They compiled months of documentation. The threatening messages, the evidence of tracking, the testimony from shelter workers, from the man who'd intervened, from Samira herself. They charged Elias not just with violating the protective order, but with attempted kidnapping, harassment, and making terroristic threats. During the trial, Elias presented himself as the victim. He claimed Samira had poisoned their relationship, that she'd fabricated abuse allegations to gain custody of Layla. He cried on the stand. He showed photos of happy family moments, trying to convince the jury that their marriage had been good until Samira changed. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical records documenting injuries Samira had sustained during their marriage. Text messages where Elias explicitly threatened her life. Testimony from neighbors who'd heard violent arguments. The tracking software discovered on her phone. The pattern of stalking that had continued for months after the protective order was issued. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Elias Ramon guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, calling him a danger to society, and noting that his behavior demonstrated a complete inability to accept accountability for his actions. Samira's family issued a statement apologizing for initially believing Elias, acknowledging how convincing abusers can be, how easy it is to doubt victims even when you love them. They became advocates for domestic violence awareness, speaking publicly about the dangers of intimate partner violence and the importance of believing survivors. Samira rebuilt her life slowly. She completed her social work degree. She now works specifically with domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help others recognize warning signs she missed, to validate the fear they feel, to remind them that leaving is brave even when it feels impossible. Layla is now 3 years old. She doesn't remember the park. She doesn't remember her father. Samira struggles with whether to tell her daughter the truth someday, or to let her grow up without the weight of knowing what violence she escaped. The case sparked conversations about how technology enables abusers, about how protective orders need enforcement mechanisms beyond paper, about how the legal system often fails victims until violence escalates to attempted murder. Advocacy groups pushed for better tracking of protective order violations, for training police to recognize stalking patterns, for laws that criminalize installing monitoring software without consent. But even with Elias in prison, Samira lives with hypervigilance. She checks locks multiple times. She monitors her surroundings constantly. She's careful about what she posts online, what information she shares publicly, because she knows that some abusers have people on the outside willing to do their work for them. She knows that even prison bars don't guarantee safety. People ask me how I survived, Samira said in an interview with a domestic violence organization. But survival isn't just getting out alive. It's rebuilding yourself after someone tried to destroy you. It's learning to trust again when trust was used as a weapon against you. It's waking up every day and choosing to believe that life can be good again, even when fear tells you otherwise. The third story shifts to a different kind of terror. Not isolation and wilderness, not violence and intimacy, but random chaos in a city where millions of people tried to live normal lives while a killer walked among them. Harbor City in the summer of 1976 felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The heat was oppressive, the kind that makes people irritable and restless. Crime rates were already elevated. The city was struggling with economic decline, racial tensions, and a police force that felt overwhelmed and under-resourced. Into this environment came a killer who called himself the Night Listener. His first attack happened on a July evening. A young couple sitting in a parked car near a popular overlook. They were talking, listening to music, enjoying the view of city lights below them. Someone approached the car. The couple assumed it was police or security. Instead, it was a man with a gun who fired through the window without warning, without demands, without any apparent motive. The woman died instantly. The man survived, but was critically injured. When he was finally able to speak to investigators, he described a figure in dark clothing, face partially obscured, who said nothing before shooting. No robbery, no sexual assault, just violence, and then disappearance into the night. 2 weeks later, another attack. A woman walking her dog in a residential neighborhood, shot from behind as she passed under a streetlight. She survived, but couldn't describe her attacker. She'd heard footsteps, then gunfire, then woke up in a hospital. The attacks continued through August. Different locations, different victims. No pattern that made sense. Young and old, male and female, different neighborhoods, different times, different circumstances. The only consistency was the randomness. Harbor City descended into panic. People stopped going out after dark unless absolutely necessary. Sales of guns and security systems skyrocketed. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. Parents kept children inside. The city that never slept became a city afraid of its own shadows. Media coverage was constant. Every attack led front-page news. Reporters interviewed victims, families, witnesses who'd seen nothing but heard shots. Criminal psychologists were brought in to profile the killer. They speculated about motives, about psychology, about whether this was one person or multiple attackers. Then the letters started arriving. The first letter came to a major newspaper in September. Written in strange, disjointed language, it claimed responsibility for the attacks. The writer called himself the Night Listener, and said he was following orders from forces beyond human understanding. He described hearing voices that told him who to target, when to strike, where to go. He said he was chosen for this work, that he had no choice but to obey. The letter included details about the attacks that hadn't been made public, details only the killer could know. Police confirmed its authenticity. More letters followed, each one more disturbing than the last. The writer described his victims, gave them nicknames, talked about feeling their fear. He claimed supernatural knowledge. He wrote poetry that mixed violence with mysticism. He seemed to be playing with investigators, with the media, with the entire terrified city. It felt like he was everywhere and nowhere, one detective recalled. People called in tips constantly. They'd seen someone suspicious in their neighborhood. They'd heard strange noises. They'd received weird looks from strangers. We investigated thousands of leads. None of them went anywhere. The attacks peaked in October. 7 shootings in 1 month. 3 fatalities. Harbor City felt like a war zone. The mayor faced pressure to call in federal assistance. The police commissioner promised results that seemed impossible to deliver. Then, on a rainy November night, a patrol officer pulled over a vehicle for running a stop sign. Standard traffic stop. The officer approached the driver's window, asked for license and registration. The driver complied, acting nervous but not unusually so. Lots of people get nervous during traffic stops. The officer noticed something in the back seat. A duffel bag partially unzipped. Inside, visible in the flashlight beam, the metallic gleam of a firearm. "Step out of the vehicle, please." The driver's name was Marcus Levin. He was 34, worked in maintenance at a hospital, lived alone in a small apartment on the city's east side. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags that would have put him on anyone's radar. But the gun in his back seat matched ballistics from 5 of the shootings. When investigators searched his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, and disturbing journals filled with the same disjointed writing style as the letters. They found maps with locations marked. They found newspaper clippings about the attacks. They found everything except a clear motive. Marcus Levin was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. He initially claimed that dark forces had controlled him, that he'd heard voices commanding him to kill, that he was merely an instrument of powers beyond mortal comprehension. His defense attorneys suggested severe mental illness, arguing he was not competent to stand trial. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Experts disagreed. Some believed Levin experienced genuine psychotic episodes. Others thought he was malingeant, faking mental illness to avoid accountability. The debate about his mental state became central to the case. During trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming physical evidence. The weapons, the journals, the letters, witnesses who placed him near attack locations, ballistic matches. It was clear Marcus Levin was the night listener. What remained unclear was whether he should be held fully responsible for actions he claimed were driven by mental illness. The jury found him guilty, but mentally ill, a verdict that acknowledged his psychological state while still holding him criminally responsible. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without possibility of parole, to be served in a psychiatric facility within the prison system. But even decades later, questions linger. Was Marcus Levin truly mentally ill, or did he understand exactly what he was doing? Did he deserve treatment or pure punishment? Where is the line between illness and evil, and does that line matter to the families of his victims? One survivor, the man who'd been shot alongside his girlfriend who died, spoke at Levin's sentencing hearing. "I don't care if he heard voices," he said. "I don't care if he was sick. What I care about is that my girlfriend is dead, that I have nightmares every night, that a whole city lived in terror because one person decided our lives didn't matter." Mental illness doesn't erase the harm he caused. It doesn't bring back the people he killed. It doesn't undo the trauma. The night listener case forced conversations about how society handles violent offenders with mental illness, about whether the criminal justice system or the mental health system should take primacy, about whether punishment and treatment can coexist, about whether some people are simply too dangerous to ever be released, regardless of their psychological state. Harbor City slowly recovered. The fear lessened. People began going out again, reclaiming their neighborhoods, their routines, their city. But survivors of those attacks, the people who'd been shot and lived, the families who'd lost someone, they carried the terror forward. For them, the night listener never fully disappeared. Marcus Levin remains incarcerated. He's now in his 80s, housed in a specialized unit for aging inmates with severe mental health issues. He sometimes gives interviews, still claiming that forces beyond his control drove his actions. Other times, he seems to have no memory of the attacks at all. Whether this is genuine cognitive decline or continued manipulation remains unclear. The fourth and final story begins on a day that felt completely ordinary. A Thursday in February. No school because of a teacher development day. Two teenage girls deciding to spend their free time outdoors before winter released its grip. Lily Carter was 13. Noelle Hart was 14. They'd been best friends since elementary school, the kind of friendship that felt permanent, that survived school drama and changing interests and all the turbulence of adolescence. They lived in a small town called Brookline, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where parents let their kids walk to friends' houses unsupervised, where danger felt like something that happened in cities, not here. That morning, Lily texted Noelle around 10. "Want to go walk the trail? Weather's supposed to be nice." Noelle replied immediately, "Yes, meet you at the crossing in 20. The Brookline Trail crossing was a popular walking spot, a simple trail that followed a creek through a wooded area just outside town. Families walked it regularly. Joggers used it for exercise. It was maintained by the local parks department and considered completely safe. Lily and Noelle met as planned. They walked the trail, talking about school, about music, about nothing and everything the way teenage girls do. Noelle had her phone with her. She was taking random photos and videos, documenting their afternoon the way her generation documented everything. Around 2 in the afternoon, Lily's mother texted asking when she'd be home. No response. She wasn't worried initially. Teenagers are notorious for not checking their phones. But by 4, when Lily still hadn't responded or come home, concern shifted to worry. Lily's mother called Noelle's mother. Neither girl had returned home. Neither was answering their phone. The mothers tried to tell themselves not to panic. The girls had probably lost track of time. They'd wandered farther than intended. They'd turn up soon, apologetic for not checking in. By 5, both families were calling friends, checking social media, retracing where the girls might have gone. By 6, they contacted police. Officers began searching immediately. They started at the trail crossing where the girls had planned to walk. They found Noelle's phone on the ground near the trail, screen cracked, as if it had been dropped. They found no other evidence. No signs of struggle, no blood, no clothing, just the phone. Search parties mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area. They searched the trail, the surrounding woods, the creek, abandoned buildings, anywhere 2 girls might have gotten lost or hurt. They brought in dogs. They used thermal imaging. They searched through the night and into the next day. They found nothing. Investigators examined Noelle's phone. Most of it was ordinary content. Photos of the sky, of Lily making silly faces, of the creek. Videos of them talking about random teenage concerns. But there was one video file that made investigators' blood run cold. The video had been recorded at approximately 1:30 that afternoon. It showed the trail ahead, Lily walking a few feet in front of Noelle. Noelle was narrating their walk, her voice cheerful and unconcerned. Then, faintly, another sound. Footsteps. Someone approaching from behind. Noelle kept filming, but her narration stopped. There were a few seconds of silence, except for footsteps, growing closer. Then a voice. Male. Older. Down the hill. Just 3 words. But the tone carried undeniable menace. Command. Threat. The video continued for a few more seconds. Shaky movement. A glimpse of ground. Then it stopped. That video became evidence, but it also became torture for the families. Because it captured the moment when everything changed. The moment when an ordinary afternoon became a nightmare. The moment when 2 girls who'd been safe their entire lives realized they weren't safe anymore. Investigators released audio from the video to the public, hoping someone would recognize the voice. Tips flooded in. Thousands of calls from people who thought they knew someone who sounded like that. Investigators followed every lead. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at sex offenders in the area. They examined everyone who had any connection to Brookline or the trail. Weeks became months. The case grew cold. Media attention faded. The families refused to let it go. They kept the story alive through social media, through interviews, through constant advocacy. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. But most of all, they wanted their girls back. Years passed. The case was technically active, but there were no new leads. The investigation had gone in circles, exhausted every obvious avenue. The families faced the horrible reality that they might never know what happened. Then, 5 years after the girls disappeared, a detective reviewing old case files noticed something. The three-word command, "down the hill," had a specific cadence, a specific tone. It reminded her of something, though she couldn't immediately place what. She started listening to old interviews. Hours of recorded conversations with witnesses, persons of interest, anyone connected to the case. Most yielded nothing. But one interview, given by a man named Thomas Reed in the initial investigation, caught her attention. Thomas Reed had been interviewed because he lived near the trail. He'd been one of hundreds of people questioned in the early days of the investigation. He'd seemed cooperative. He'd claimed he hadn't been near the trail that day. He'd been at home, he said, alone. Investigators had no reason to disbelieve him. No evidence placed him at the scene. He was cleared, and the investigation moved on. But listening to his voice again, 5 years later, the detective heard it. The cadence, the tone. It wasn't identical to the recording. People modulate their voices, but there was something familiar about the way he spoke. She brought this to the investigation team. They were skeptical. Voice analysis isn't conclusive. They'd need more than a detective's instinct. But they decided to look more closely at Thomas Reed. Reed was 48 years old. He worked at a local factory. He'd lived in Brookline for over a decade. He had a previous arrest for harassment of a minor in another state, something that hadn't shown up in the initial background check because it had been expunged from his record. Investigators dug deeper. They examined his movements on the day the girls disappeared. They looked at his phone records, his vehicle's GPS history, anything that could place him at the trail. What they found was a gap. His phone had been off for several hours in the middle of the day. His GPS showed his vehicle parked near an access point to the trail around the time the girls were there. Reed had lied about being home alone, but lying wasn't proof of murder. Investigators needed more. They obtained warrants to search Reed's property. They went through his house, his vehicle, a small shed on his land. In the shed, buried under old tools and equipment, they found a firearm. Ballistics testing revealed that this gun had been fired in the vicinity where the girls were last seen. Trace evidence on the weapon linked it to the area. They also found, hidden in a compartment beneath the shed's floor, items of clothing that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Lily and Noel. Thomas Reed was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple other related charges. He maintained his innocence. He claimed the evidence was planted. He said investigators were desperate to close the case and had targeted him unfairly. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented the video evidence, the voice analysis, the physical evidence from Reed's property, the lies he'd told during the initial investigation. They constructed a timeline showing Reed had opportunity and means. They brought in experts who testified about the voice match, about the trace evidence, about every piece of the puzzle that pointed to Reed's guilt. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that voice analysis wasn't reliable science, that the items found on Reed's property could have been placed there by someone else, that police had tunnel vision and ignored other possibilities. But the jury wasn't convinced. They deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they announced guilty verdicts on all counts. Lily's mother collapsed in the courtroom. Noel's father let out a sound that was part sob, part primal scream. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of not knowing. And now, finally, something resembling justice. At sentencing, both families read victim impact statements. They talked about the girls they'd lost. Lily, who wanted to be a veterinarian, who rescued injured birds and nursed them back to health. Noel, who wrote poetry, who made everyone laugh, who had the kind of energy that filled rooms. They talked about the years of torture, of wondering every single day what had happened, of imagining the worst while desperately hoping for something better, of holidays that felt hollow, of birthdays marked only by absence, of the way trauma had fractured their families, ended marriages, turned grief into something that consumed everything. "You took our daughters," Lily's mother said to Reed. "But you also took our ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe the world is anything other than a dangerous place where evil hides in plain sight. You took our peace. You took our hope. You took futures that should have been full of graduation days and first loves and all the ordinary miracles of watching children become adults. And for what? What did killing them give you? What did you gain from destroying so many lives? Reed showed no emotion during the impact statements. He stared straight ahead, his face blank, offering nothing in the way of explanation or remorse. The judge sentenced him to life without possibility of parole. In his remarks, the judge noted that Reed had shown no accountability, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of his crimes. He called Reed a danger to society and said the only appropriate sentence was one ensuring he would never have the opportunity to harm anyone again. But even with Reed convicted and sentenced, the families faced a painful reality. The girls' bodies had never been recovered. Reed refused to disclose what he'd done with them. Investigators believed, based on evidence and Reed's movements that day, that Lily and Noelle had been killed shortly after being abducted. But without bodies, without that final piece of closure, the families lived with a particular kind of unfinished grief. People don't understand what it's like to not be able to bury your child, Noelle's mother said in an interview. We can't visit a grave. We can't have that ritual of bringing flowers, of having a place to go when we need to feel close to her. Instead, we live with this absence that has no physical marker. It's grief without an endpoint. The case sparked national conversations about how predators identify and target victims, about the vulnerability of young people in spaces considered safe, about the importance of technology in modern investigations. Law enforcement agencies nationwide used the case as a training example for how digital evidence, even brief and seemingly insignificant recordings, can become crucial investigative tools. Schools implemented new safety protocols. Parents in Brookline and similar small towns reconsidered assumptions about safety. The trail where Lily and Noelle had walked remained open, but it felt different now. People still used it, but they went in groups. They stayed alert. They taught their children about awareness in ways that felt heartbreaking in their necessity. Some criticized the sharing of the video evidence with the public, arguing it traumatized the families to have that moment of their daughter's last afternoon broadcast repeatedly. Others defended it as necessary for generating tips that ultimately led to Reed's arrest. The debate highlighted tensions between investigative needs and family privacy, between justice and dignity. The girls' families established a foundation focused on missing children cases, particularly those that go cold. They advocate for better resource allocation for unsolved cases, for the use of emerging technologies in re-examining evidence, for support systems that help families navigate years of uncertainty. They turn their grief into action, finding purpose in preventing other families from experiencing what they've endured. Online communities that had obsessed over the case for years had mixed reactions to Reed's conviction. Some felt vindicated that their theories had been correct. Others struggled with the fact that justice for Lily and Noelle meant only imprisonment for Reed, not restoration of what was lost. The case became a touchstone for discussions about true crime ethics, about the line between interest and exploitation, about respect for victims and families. Reed remains imprisoned. He gives no interviews. He has filed appeals that have been consistently denied. He maintains that he's innocent, but he offers no alternative explanation for the evidence. He refuses to speak to investigators about the girl's location. His silence feels like a final act of cruelty, a way to maintain control even from behind bars. The detective who noticed the voice similarity, who pushed for a second look at Thomas Reed, received commendations for her work. But she's spoken publicly about the cost of working cold cases, about the way the victims stay with you, about how you carry their faces with you long after files are closed. She retired from law enforcement 2 years after Reed's conviction, saying she'd given everything she had to give. These 4 stories, separated by geography and circumstance, share common threads that investigators and victim advocates recognize immediately. Each case involved a predator who exploited spaces of perceived safety. Raymond Barrett used wilderness. Elias Rahman used intimacy. Marcus Levin used randomness. Thomas Reed used familiarity. Each predator understood something fundamental about human nature. We want to trust. We want to believe that forests are peaceful, that love is safe, that our neighborhoods protect us, that familiar places hold no danger. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that we'd recognize a predator if we encountered one. But predators rely on our assumptions. They count on our tendency to trust what seems familiar, to rationalize warning signs, to believe that danger looks a certain way. Barrett was just a friendly drifter with a dog. Ramon was charming and progressive. Levin worked a regular job and blended into his community. Reed lived nearby and seemed like a normal neighbor. None of them fit the stereotype of what we think a monster looks like. And that's precisely what made them effective. The cases also reveal failures in systems meant to protect people. Rangers who didn't track a drifter's movements across multiple preserves. Police who didn't take domestic violence seriously enough until attempted murder occurred. A city overwhelmed by crime that struggled to connect random attacks into a pattern. A small town that couldn't imagine predatory violence in familiar spaces. These failures aren't about individual incompetence. They're about systemic gaps, about resource limitations, about the challenge of identifying threats before they become tragedies. In each case, investigators worked diligently once they recognized the danger. But by then, victims had already been harmed. The question becomes, how do we balance awareness with the ability to live freely? How do we protect ourselves without becoming paralyzed by fear? How do we teach children about danger without stealing their innocence? How do we recognize warning signs without becoming suspicious of everyone around us? There are no easy answers. But victims and families and investigators who've lived through these cases offer some guidance. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, honor that feeling. If someone makes you uncomfortable, you don't owe them politeness. If a relationship involves control disguised as care, recognize it for what it is. Pay attention to patterns. Multiple missing persons in similar areas might not be coincidence. Escalating control in relationships predicts violence. Random crimes might have connections investigators haven't recognized yet. Details that seem insignificant, a voice on a recording, a dog at an ATM, a minor traffic violation, can break cases open. Believe victims. When someone says they're afraid, take them seriously. When someone reports abuse, investigate thoroughly. When someone raises concerns about safety, listen rather than dismiss. So many cases involve victims who tried to get help, but weren't believed until it was too late. Support investigations. Come forward with tips even if you think they might not matter. Many cases are solved because someone noticed something small and chose to report it. The witness who called police when Samira was attacked at the park. The officer who made a routine traffic stop. The detective who heard something familiar in old interview recordings. Small actions create opportunities for justice. Document everything. The families in these cases learned that evidence matters immensely. Photos, videos, messages, medical records, anything that creates a timeline or proves a pattern. Technology gives us tools our predecessors didn't have. Use them. Back them up. Store them safely. Remember that justice is imperfect. Even when perpetrators are convicted and sentenced, victims don't get their lives back. Survivors carry trauma forward. Families live with loss that never fully heals. Communities bear scars long after headlines fade. Justice matters, but it's not the same as restoration. The forests where Barrett hunted have reopened. New hikers walk those trails, most unaware of what happened there. Some argue the areas should have markers, memorials acknowledging the victims. Others say that would create sites of morbid tourism. The debate reflects broader tensions about how we remember trauma in public spaces. Samira still lives in England, though she's moved to a different city for a fresh start. She's remarried, this time to someone who understands that trust must be earned and maintained, never demanded. She says she'll never fully stop looking over her shoulder, but she's learned that hypervigilance and happiness can coexist if you work hard enough. Harbor City's crime has declined significantly since the 1970s. The neighborhood where some of the night listeners' attacks occurred is now gentrified and expensive. Younger residents often don't know the history. Older residents remember too well. Memorial plaques honor the victims, but they're easy to walk past without noticing. Brookline still struggles with its identity as the town where two girls were taken from a trail that everyone trusted. The trail remains open, but the town added security cameras, emergency call boxes, and increased police patrols. Some families moved away, unable to stay in a place that held such painful memories. Others stayed, determined not to let what happened define their home. The foundation established by Lily and Noel's families has helped provide resources for other families dealing with missing children cases. They fund DNA testing for unidentified remains. They provide support for families navigating investigations. They advocate for policy changes that prioritize cold cases. The work doesn't bring their daughters back, but it channels grief into something that helps others. If there's a lesson in these stories, it's not that the world is uniformly dangerous or that we should live in constant fear. Most people are good. Most places are safe. Most days pass without incident. But acknowledging that predators exist, that they're often unremarkable in appearance, that they exploit our assumptions about safety, doesn't mean living in fear. It means living with awareness. Awareness means teaching children that adults shouldn't ask them for help or try to isolate them. It means recognizing that abusive relationships often begin with charm and attentiveness before revealing control. It means reporting suspicious behavior even when you're not certain it means anything. It means trusting that uncomfortable feeling in your gut when something doesn't seem right. Awareness also means supporting systems that protect vulnerable people, funding for domestic violence shelters, resources for investigating missing persons cases, training for law enforcement to recognize patterns of predatory behavior, technology that helps track and solve crimes, mental health services that might prevent some violence before it occurs. The perpetrators in these 4 cases are all serving life sentences. They've been removed from society. They can't harm anyone else. But the damage they caused ripples outward indefinitely. Every person who knew a victim carries that loss. Every family member rearranges their life around absence. Every community questions assumptions about safety. Raymond Barrett, now in his 70s, occasionally gives interviews from prison. He shows no remorse. He talks about his crimes with clinical detachment, as if discussing someone else's actions. Psychologists who've evaluated him describe him as having antisocial personality disorder, completely lacking empathy or conscience. He'll die in prison, and the world will be safer for it. Elias Rahman has filed multiple appeals, all denied. He maintains he was falsely accused, that Samira fabricated everything. His family has largely disowned him, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the evidence presented at trial. He'll also die in prison, and Samira will finally be able to breathe without fear. Marcus Levin's mental state continues to deteriorate. Whether this is genuine cognitive decline or continued manipulation remains debated. He receives psychiatric treatment in a prison facility. Some argue he should be in a pure mental health setting. Others say he should receive no special accommodations. The debate about how to handle mentally ill violent offenders continues without clear resolution. Thomas Reed remains the least forthcoming of the 4. He speaks to no one. He engages with prison programming minimally. He exists in a kind of self-imposed isolation, perhaps understanding that he's hated even among fellow inmates. Crimes against children are viewed with particular contempt in prison culture. Reed requires protective custody to survive. But focusing only on perpetrators misses what matters most. The victims, the survivors, the families who carry on. Walter and Elaine Morris were planning to hike trails in Scotland for their 50th anniversary. They'd been researching routes, saving money, learning about the highlands they'd always wanted to visit. That trip will never happen. Their children honor them by hiking, by continuing the passion their parents shared, by refusing to let Barrett's evil steal all the joy their parents found in wilderness. Hannah Pierce wanted to travel after nursing school. She had a list of countries she hoped to visit, causes she wanted to volunteer for, a life she imagined full of purpose and adventure. Her best friend visits those countries in her memory, documenting the trips through photos and journal entries written as letters to Hannah. It's not the same, but it's a way of honoring what was lost. The couple from Harbor City who were shot in their car had planned to get married that fall. She died. He survived, but with injuries that changed his life permanently. He never married. He says he couldn't imagine sharing his life with anyone else. He works with victims of violent crime now, helping them navigate trauma, showing them that survival is possible even when it doesn't feel like victory. Lily Carter kept a journal where she wrote stories about animals she wanted to rescue. Noelle Hart left behind poetry that her mother compiled into a small published volume. These weren't just girls who died. They were people with dreams and talents and futures that should have unfolded over decades. Their absence isn't just loss. It's theft of all the good they would have created in the world. When we hear about true crime, it's easy to get caught up in the details of investigation, in the puzzle of how cases were solved, in the psychology of why predators do what they do. But the real story isn't about the perpetrators. It's about the people whose lives were cut short or forever altered. It's about the love that endures even after death. It's about families who transform grief into advocacy. It's about survivors who rebuild despite trauma. It's about communities that refuse to let fear win. These stories matter not because they're sensational, but because they're true. They happen to real people in real places. They could happen again tomorrow. Not because the world is uniquely dangerous now, but because predatory behavior is a consistent element of human societies. As long as people exist, some percentage will exploit vulnerabilities for their own gratification. But for every predator, there are thousands of people working to prevent harm, to solve crimes, to support victims, to create systems that protect the vulnerable. There are rangers who pay attention to who's camping in remote areas. There are domestic violence counselors who believe survivors and help them escape. There are police officers who make routine traffic stops that break cases open. There are detectives who listen to old recordings one more time because they refuse to give up. There are also ordinary people who make choices that matter. The man who intervened at the park when Elias attacked Samira, risking his own safety to protect a stranger. The person who called police when they noticed suspicious activity. The witness who remembered seeing something that seemed insignificant at the time, but became crucial evidence later. Heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just paying attention and choosing to act. The families in these cases have become reluctant experts on trauma, on grief, on navigating systems that aren't designed for their particular nightmare. They've learned that closure is a myth, that you don't move on from losing someone to violence, that healing isn't linear. They've learned that people mean well, but often say hurtful things because they don't know how to acknowledge such profound loss. They've learned that some days are survivable, and some days require just breathing in and out until the day ends. They've also learned that connecting with other families who've experienced similar losses creates a community of understanding that outsiders can't provide. They've learned that advocacy gives purpose when grief threatens to consume everything. They've learned that speaking publicly about their experiences, as painful as it is, might prevent someone else's tragedy. If you're watching this and you've experienced violence, if you've lost someone to crime, if you carry trauma that makes the world feel unsafe, know that you're not alone. There are resources available. There are people who understand. There are communities that will support you. Survival doesn't mean being unaffected. It means continuing despite the effects. If you're watching this and you recognize warning signs in your own life, if you feel controlled or afraid in your relationship, if someone makes you uncomfortable in ways you can't quite articulate, trust yourself. Your instincts exist for a reason. Reaching out for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom. If you're watching this and you work in law enforcement, in victim services, in any field that touches these issues, thank you. The work is hard. The outcomes are often imperfect. The trauma you witness secondhand accumulates. Your effort matters even when results feel inadequate. And if you're watching this simply out of interest in true crime, out of fascination with how these cases unfold, consider what draws you to these stories. Is it the puzzle? The psychology? The resolution? Whatever the reason, remember these are real people whose worst days are being examined. Treat their stories with the respect that suffering deserves. These 4 cases span decades and circumstances, but they converge on essential truths about human nature. We want to trust. We want to feel safe. We want to believe that danger is recognizable. And sometimes, those wants blind us to reality. Predators understand this. They know that appearing harmless grants access. They know that familiarity breeds trust. They know that we're more likely to doubt ourselves than to act on instincts that might seem paranoid. They weaponize our desire to be polite, to give people the benefit of doubt, to not cause trouble over feelings we can't quite justify. But those feelings, those instincts, they're information worth considering. They're pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness. They're your brain noticing details that don't quite fit, behaviors that seem off, situations that feel wrong. Honoring those instincts doesn't mean acting on them without thought. It means taking them seriously enough to investigate further, to remove yourself from questionable situations, to ask for help if needed. The challenge is finding balance. Living with appropriate caution without becoming paralyzed by fear. Teaching children about safety without stealing their innocence. Being aware of danger without assuming everyone is dangerous. It's a difficult balance, and different people find it in different ways. Some families who've experienced these tragedies become advocates for tighter restrictions, for more surveillance, for for systems that prioritize safety over privacy. Others resist what they see as fear-based responses, arguing that we can't prevent all violence and shouldn't sacrifice freedom attempting to do so. Both perspectives come from love, from a desire to protect others from experiencing similar loss. The reality is that perfect safety doesn't exist. We can reduce risk. We can make better choices. We can support systems that protect vulnerable people. But we cannot eliminate danger entirely. Some violence is preventable, some isn't. Learning to live with that uncertainty while still engaging fully with life requires courage. The victims in these stories showed courage in different ways. Walter and Elaine Morris had the courage to keep exploring wilderness even in their 70s, to embrace adventure rather than retreat into cautious comfort. Samira had the courage to leave an abusive relationship despite knowing it was the most dangerous moment. The Harbor City victims had the courage to live normal lives even when their city felt terrified. Lily and Noelle had the ordinary courage of childhood, the assumption that the world was safe enough to walk a familiar trail on a Thursday afternoon. Their courage didn't protect them. That's the heartbreaking truth. Being brave, being careful, being experienced, none of it guarantees safety. But the alternative, living in constant fear, isn't living at all. The perpetrators in these cases don't just take lives. They take the sense that the world is navigable, that reasonable precautions are sufficient, that we have control over our own safety. Refusing to give them that power, continuing to hike and love and trust, and explore despite knowing danger exists, that's its own form of resistance. It's saying that predators don't get to dictate how we live, that their evil doesn't define our world, that we'll take reasonable precautions without surrendering the freedoms and joys that make life worth living. This doesn't mean being naive. It means being realistic about risk while refusing to be controlled by it. It means teaching children about boundaries and consent and when to seek help, while also letting them play outside and explore and develop independence. It means supporting partners and friends who report abuse, while also remaining open to relationships yourself. It means being aware of your surroundings without assuming every stranger is a threat. The investigators who work these cases understand this balance. They see the worst of humanity regularly. They know in detail what predators are capable of. Yet most of them have families, let their children play sports and attend sleepovers, go hiking, live normal lives. They take precautions. They teach awareness. But they don't let the darkness of their work consume the light in their personal lives. One detective who worked the Barrett case said something that stayed with many people. If I let what I've seen in this job destroy my ability to trust, to connect, to believe in goodness, then the predators win. They don't just take victims. They take our faith in humanity. I refuse to give them that. I choose to believe that most people are good, that most days are safe, that evil is the exception rather than the rule. Because statistically, that's true. The horrific cases are memorable precisely because they're unusual. That perspective doesn't diminish the pain of victims and families. Their experiences are real and valid and life-altering. But it does provide context. Millions of people hike every year without encountering predators like Barrett. Millions of relationships are healthy and safe, unlike what Samira experienced. Most cities never face a serial killer like Levin. Most children walk trails and return home without incident, unlike Lily and Noelle. The cases we remember are the outliers. They're the tragedies that shouldn't happen, but sometimes do. Focusing exclusively on them distorts our perception of risk. It makes us see danger where statistics say safety is far more likely. This doesn't mean ignoring red flags or dismissing instincts. It means calibrating our fear response to actual risk rather than to the memorable horror stories. Children growing up now face a different landscape than previous generations. They have access to information about danger that previous generations didn't. They're taught about stranger danger, about inappropriate touch, about recognizing manipulation. They're tracked via phones and smartwatches. They're surveilled in schools and public spaces. All of this is intended to keep them safer. But there are costs to this approach. Children who are taught to fear constantly grow into adults who struggle with anxiety and trust. Children who are never allowed unsupervised play don't develop the independence and risk assessment skills they'll need as adults. Children who are tracked constantly don't learn to navigate the world on their own. Finding the right balance between protection and development is an ongoing challenge for parents and educators. The families in these cases have different views on this. Some advocate for maximum protection, believing that if tracking technology or stricter supervision had existed when their children disappeared, outcomes might have been different. Others argue that we can't parent from a place of fear, that we have to let children take age-appropriate risks, even knowing that occasionally those risks result in tragedy. There's no perfect answer. Every family has to decide what feels right for their circumstances, their children, their community. What matters is making those decisions consciously rather than from a place of either naive trust or paralyzing fear. As this story ends, it's important to return to where it began. The illusion of safety. The spaces we trust. The routines we follow without questioning. These aren't bad things. Feeling safe in our environments, trusting in our relationships, believing our communities protect us, these are necessary for psychological well-being. We can't function in constant fear, but perhaps safety needs to be understood differently. Not as a guarantee, but as a probability. Not as something that exists because we want it to, but as something we actively create through awareness, through systems, through communities that look out for each other. Safety isn't passive. It's active. It requires participation. That participation looks different for different people. For some, it means volunteering with search and rescue organizations. For others, it means donating to domestic violence shelters or advocacy organizations. For some, it means attending community meetings about safety policies. For others, it simply means paying attention to their surroundings and being willing to help if they witness something concerning. Every person who takes these small actions contributes to a culture where predators have less space to operate, where victims are believed and supported, where investigating crimes is properly resourced, where communities prioritize protecting vulnerable members. Safety is a collective project, not an individual guarantee. The 4 perpetrators in these stories are imprisoned. They'll never hurt anyone else. But their absence doesn't undo the harm they caused. It doesn't restore what was taken. It doesn't heal the families who lost loved ones or the survivors who carry trauma. Justice provides accountability, but it's not restoration. What provides something closer to restoration is the work that comes after. The foundations established in victims' names. The policy changes advocated for by families. The awareness raised about warning signs and risk factors. The support provided to other families facing similar tragedies. The refusal to let these stories be only about violence, making them also about resilience and love and the determination that these lives mattered. Walter and Elaine Morris mattered, not just because of how they died, but because of how they lived. 45 years of marriage, decades of exploring wilderness together, children and grandchildren who carry their memory forward. Hannah Pierce mattered, her compassion as a nurse, her independence, her courage in seeking solitude to heal from a difficult relationship. The victims in Harbor City mattered. Each one had families, dreams, routines, lives that were valuable regardless of how they ended. Samira Nur matters. Her survival, her advocacy, her refusal to let abuse define her identity, her work helping other survivors, her daughter growing up knowing that her mother is brave and strong and that leaving violence is possible. Lily Carter and Noelle Hart mattered. 13 and 14 years old. Entire lives ahead of them. They mattered not just as victims, but as children who were loved, who had potential, who should have been given the chance to grow up. Their families ensure that they're remembered as the complete people they were, not reduced to a single terrible afternoon. If you've stayed with these stories all the way through, thank you. Thank you for bearing witness to these lives. Thank you for considering the lessons they offer. Thank you for treating these cases with the seriousness and respect they deserve. If these stories have affected you, if they've brought up difficult memories or fears, please reach out for support. There are crisis lines available. There are therapists who specialize in trauma. There are support groups for victims of violence, for families of missing persons, for anyone navigating grief and loss. You don't have to carry it alone. Before you go, I want to ask you to do something. Subscribe to this channel if you found value in this story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your reflections, or even just where you're watching from. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like these reach people who need to hear them, whether that's someone recognizing warning signs in their own life, someone supporting a friend through crisis, or simply someone who needs to understand that they're not alone. Like this video if you believe these stories matter. Share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Not to spread fear, but to spread awareness. Not to make people paranoid, but to help them be appropriately cautious. Not to define the world by its dangers, but to acknowledge that those dangers exist and deserve our attention. The ultimate truth these 4 stories reveal is this: predators exist. They exploit our assumptions about safety. They hide in plain sight. They rely on our reluctance to believe that evil can look ordinary. But awareness narrows the space where they can operate. Justice, even when delayed, provides accountability. Communities that support victims and believe survivors make predation harder. And refusing to live in fear, while remaining appropriately cautious, is its own form of resistance. Evil happens. That's an uncomfortable truth. But goodness also happens. People who intervene when witnessing violence. Investigators who work cases for years without giving up. Families who transform grief into advocacy. Communities that support rather than blame victims. Survivors who rebuild lives despite trauma. That goodness matters just as much as the evil, perhaps more. The forest trails where Barrett hunted remain beautiful. People still hike them, still find peace and wonder in wilderness. Relationships still bring joy and partnership and love to millions of people, despite the reality of abuse existing. Cities function and thrive even in places where violence once created fear. Teenagers still walk trails with friends, documenting ordinary moments that usually remain ordinary. The world contains both danger and beauty, both predators and protectors, both tragedy and resilience. Living in it fully requires acknowledging all of that, not minimizing the risks, not exaggerating them, just seeing reality clearly and choosing how to move through it with as much awareness, courage, and compassion as we can manage. These 4 stories don't have happy endings, but they have meaningful ones. They remind us that victims matter, that justice is worth pursuing even when it's slow, that awareness isn't paranoia, that communities can choose to prioritize safety and support, that even in the darkest stories, there are threads of courage and love and determination that deserve recognition. The illusion of safety, the promise this story began with, isn't entirely false. Most places are safe. Most people are good. Most days pass without incident. But safety isn't automatic. It's created and maintained through awareness, through systems, through communities that care about protecting vulnerable members. Understanding that doesn't mean living in fear. It means living with eyes open. And perhaps that's enough. Open eyes, open hearts, willingness to pay attention, to help when needed, to believe victims, to support survivors, to demand accountability, to refuse to let fear dictate how we live. Perhaps that combination, multiplied across millions of people making small choices every day, creates something closer to the safety we all deserve. Thank you for listening to these stories. Thank you for bearing witness to these lives. Thank you for considering what they mean and how their lessons might apply to your own life. Remember the victims. Support the survivors. Stay aware. Stay compassionate. And keep living. Because that's what the people we've lost tonight would want for all of us. The aftermath of these cases extends far beyond the courtrooms and prison sentences. Each story created ripples that continue spreading years later, affecting how communities think about safety, how families approach risk, how investigators handle similar cases. In the wilderness preservation community, Barrett's crimes sparked intense debate about monitoring versus freedom. Some argued for mandatory check-ins at trailheads, for tracking requirements on remote trails, for increased ranger presence in backcountry areas. Others pushed back, saying that wilderness by definition should remain wild, that overmanaging outdoor spaces destroys the very experience people seek when they enter nature. The compromise that emerged in many areas includes voluntary registration systems where hikers can log their plans without mandatory enforcement, improved emergency communication options like satellite beacons at accessible price points, and educational programs that teach wilderness safety without resorting to fear tactics. These solutions don't prevent all tragedies, but they provide resources that might make a difference. National parks and protected forests also implemented better data sharing between jurisdictions. Barrett moved between states, between different preservation systems, and no single entity tracked his movements. Now there are databases where rangers can note concerning individuals, creating a network of information that might identify patterns earlier. It's not foolproof, Privacy advocates raise valid concerns about surveillance, but it represents an attempt to balance safety with civil liberties. The domestic violence community already knew what Samira's case proved again. Leaving is the most dangerous time. But her case added urgency to conversations about how technology enables abuse, how stalking laws need updating for the digital age, how protective orders require better enforcement mechanisms. Several jurisdictions now treat stalking and protective order violations more seriously, recognizing them as predictors of lethal violence rather than minor infractions. Some areas implemented GPS monitoring for high-risk abusers, tracking their location to ensure they maintain required distance from victims. This raises privacy questions, but advocates argue that someone who's proven willing to violate court orders and terrorize former partners has forfeited certain privacy expectations. Technology companies face pressure to address how their products enable stalking. Apple, Google, and other tech firms have implemented features that alert users when tracking devices might have been placed on their belongings without consent. They've created ways to disable location sharing that abusers can't override. They've developed panic button features that can alert authorities silently. These improvements come slowly and imperfectly, but they acknowledge that technology must be part of the solution when it's so often part of the problem. The Harbor City case, and others like it, forced reconsideration of how mental illness intersects with criminal responsibility. Marcus Levin claimed possession, claimed voices, claimed compulsion beyond his control. The question remains, at what point does mental illness excuse criminal behavior? Most legal systems recognize that some people, by reason of severe mental illness, genuinely cannot distinguish right from wrong or control their actions. These individuals need treatment, not punishment. But determining who truly meets that threshold versus who's malingering or using mental illness as an excuse is incredibly difficult. Psychiatrists disagree. Juries struggle. Judges make judgment calls that could go either way. The result is an imperfect system where some people who need treatment receive punishment, and some people who deserve accountability receive treatment they don't genuinely require. There's no clear solution. We can improve psychiatric evaluation methods, train juries better, provide more resources for mental health courts, but ambiguity will always exist in these cases. What's certain is that untreated severe mental illness sometimes leads to violence. Providing better access to mental health care, reducing stigma so people seek help earlier, improving crisis intervention services, all of these might prevent some cases. Not all. Mental illness doesn't automatically lead to violence. The vast majority of mentally ill people never harm anyone. But in rare cases where mental illness combines with other risk factors, intervention might change outcomes. The case of Lily and Noel transformed how law enforcement approaches cases involving minors and digital evidence. The video from Noel's phone became the key piece of evidence, but it took years to properly analyze and connect to Thomas Reed. That delay raised questions about how agencies process digital evidence, whether they have adequate technology and training, whether cases are prioritized appropriately. Many jurisdictions now have specialized units focused on digital forensics, with experts who can extract and analyze data from phones, computers, social media, and other electronic sources. They've invested in software that can enhance audio, compare voices, track digital footprints. They've developed protocols for preserving digital evidence without contamination. These improvements came too late for Lily and Noel, but they've helped solve other cases. The case also sparked conversation about how social media and online communities engage with active investigations. Thousands of people online analyzed the audio, proposed theories, identified potential suspects. Some of this was helpful, generating tips that investigators followed up on. Some was harmful, harassing innocent people, spreading misinformation, treating tragedy as entertainment. Law enforcement agencies learn to navigate this new reality where cases become public obsessions, where amateur detectives investigate alongside professionals, where families face scrutiny and speculation in real time. Some agencies now have social media strategies, ways to channel public interest into useful tips while discouraging harmful behavior. It's a difficult balance, and mistakes happen on all sides. The families of victims face impossible choices about how to engage with public interest. Some embrace it, believing visibility keeps cases active and generates leads. Others retreat, finding the attention invasive and traumatic. There's no right answer. Each family does what feels survivable. Across all 4 cases, a common thread emerges about how predators select victims. They don't choose randomly, even when it appears random. They look for vulnerability. For Barrett, that meant hikers who were isolated, tired, far from help. For Rahman, it meant someone he could cut off from support systems through relationship dynamics. For Levin, despite the apparent randomness of his attacks, he actually targeted people and locations he'd scouted, at times when witnesses were unlikely, people who seemed vulnerable in specific ways. For Reed, it meant children in a location he knew well, at a time when few others would be present. This pattern, choosing vulnerable targets, is consistent across predatory behavior. It's why children, elderly people, disabled individuals, and socially isolated people face higher risk. Not because they're inherently more vulnerable, but because predators perceive them as having fewer resources to resist or report. Understanding this helps with prevention. Traveling in groups reduces vulnerability. Staying connected to support systems makes abuse harder to hide. Being aware of surroundings and trusting instincts when something feels wrong provides time to seek help. Teaching children that adults shouldn't ask them for help or try to isolate them gives them tools to recognize inappropriate behavior. None of this guarantees safety, but it reduces risk. The criminal justice system's response to these cases also matters. When victims report abuse and aren't believed, when stalking is treated as minor harassment, when missing persons cases aren't prioritized, when investigations lack resources, predators operate with less fear of consequences. Every failure to take victims seriously, every case that's not adequately investigated, every sentence that seems too lenient, sends a message about what society tolerates. Improving this requires resources, training, cultural shifts in how law enforcement and courts approach these cases. It requires taking domestic violence calls seriously even when they seem like just a couple fighting. It requires investigating missing persons immediately rather than waiting for arbitrary time periods. It requires treating crimes against marginalized people with the same urgency as crimes against privileged people. It requires believing victims even when doing so is uncomfortable. These changes happen slowly. Some jurisdictions have made significant progress. Others lag behind. Advocates push continuously for improvements, knowing that every enhancement to the system potentially saves lives. It's frustrating work because change is incremental and imperfect, but it's necessary work. For people watching this who want to help but don't know how, there are options. Volunteer with organizations that support victims. Donate to shelters, search and rescue teams, victim advocacy groups. Contact elected officials about funding for law enforcement resources, for victim services, for mental health programs. Serve on juries and take that responsibility seriously. Mentor young people. Model healthy relationships. Intervene when witnessing concerning behavior. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to a culture where predatory behavior is harder to sustain. The question often arises, are things getting worse? Is violence increasing? Are we less safe than previous generations? The data doesn't support that narrative. Violent crime rates in most developed countries have declined significantly over recent decades. We're actually safer statistically than our parents or grandparents were. What's changed is information access. We hear about every case, see details immediately, follow investigations in real time. This creates a perception that danger is everywhere, when really we're just more aware of the danger that always existed. This matters because fear itself has costs. Children who aren't allowed independence don't develop crucial skills. Adults who view every stranger as a potential threat live with chronic stress that affects health. Communities that are paralyzed by fear lose the social connections that actually make places safer. Finding balance between awareness and functionality is essential. That balance looks different for everyone. Some people need more structure and preparation to feel safe. Others need less. What matters is making conscious choices rather than reacting purely from fear or purely from optimism. Look at actual data about risks in your area. Consider what precautions make sense for your circumstances. Teach children age-appropriate safety information without traumatizing them. Build community connections that create networks of mutual support. These 4 cases, as different as they appear, ultimately tell one story. About human vulnerability. About the predators who exploit it. about the systems that sometimes fail to protect people, about the investigators and advocates and families who refuse to give up, about survival and resilience and the determination to create meaning from tragedy. If you found this valuable, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Your engagement truly matters. Share this with someone who might benefit from these stories. Let's keep the conversation going about how we create safer communities without surrendering the freedoms and connections that make life worth living. And until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember that awareness isn't fear. It's wisdom. It's power. It's the tool that helps us navigate a world that contains both danger and beauty, both predators and protectors, both tragedy and hope. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of a community that believes these stories, these victims, these families matter.